For sure. Okay, well, go ahead and open up to Romans chapter 14. Now, it's going to be a minute before we actually look at the text of Romans 14, but when we do get there, that is where we are going. So, since this is a Bible study, we might as well start at that point. And as you're getting there, I just want to say that tonight is, of course, the first Wednesday of December. And December is the month which Christmas resides in. And due to that reason, we are going to be all Christmas all month here. And what I wanted to talk about tonight was actually Christmas myths. I want to talk about some Christmas myths tonight. Particularly two. There's two Christmas myths that I want to talk about. And those are the ones that center around why do we celebrate Christmas on December the 25th? If you were to type that little question into Google, you would see many kinds of reasons, and I submit to you that you would see many myths as to why it is that Christians celebrate Christmas on the 25th. We're going to talk about the real reason. We're going to talk about how that date came to be and how that date did not come to be. And then I want to talk about the other myth, which is the myth that goes a little something like this. Christmas is pagan. Christians shouldn't celebrate Christmas because Christmas is a pagan holiday. That, in my opinion, is a myth, and we are going to bust that myth because tonight is a night of myth-busting, Christmas edition. So, let's go ahead and just get right into that. Concerning the date, why December 25th? Why December 25th? What are some reasons that some of you have heard? Has anybody heard a reason why December the 25th was chosen? There are many different ideas as to. I think that there is at least one idea that Jesus was born in every month of the year. So throughout history, there have been ideas that Jesus was born in every month from January through December. Somebody somewhere has said something of the nature, but I haven't heard anything particular. I actually have heard something about February, and we'll talk about that tonight. But that's not really what. Has anyone else ever heard anything? Jonathan, you said something? Why do Christians celebrate the birth of Jesus on December 25th? What is it about December 25th? Why that day?
They say he's born?
Yeah, that's the day that we celebrate the birth of Christ on December 25th. And the idea is that, yes, Jesus was born on December 25th. And so that's why we celebrate his birth, is because it's his birthday. It's the day he was born. But the question is, why that day? Why do we say that day? Where did that come from? Has anyone ever heard this? So here's the first myth. This is how it goes. Has anyone ever heard of a Roman holiday called Saturnalia? Okay, so there is a holiday that was celebrated by the Romans, which was a festival called Saturnalia, which was celebrating one of the Greek god Saturn. And on this Roman holiday, what would happen is the Roman society would basically be turned upside down. The slaves would mock the masters, and the masters would pretend to submit to the slaves, and the prisoners and the fools would run the state or whatever, and the rulers would. Everything was flipped on its head, and it was just a time of drinking and carousing and debauchery. This was the Roman festival of Saturnalia. And the idea goes something like this. And this is something that you'll hear a lot. And this should always make your ears perk up when you hear it. The idea goes like this. Well, Constantine, when he was converted to Christianity around, and after the Council of Nicaea and everything, what Constantine did was take this festival of Saturnalia and he just converted it into a Christian holiday, and they called it Christmas. So instead of all the pagans celebrating this Saturnalia feast, he just baptized it basically and turned it into a Christian holiday and called it Christmas. So instead of celebrating the god Saturn, they just changed it, and now they're celebrating Jesus. They basically took this Roman festival and baptized it and turned it into a Christian holiday. And this is where the idea that Jesus was born on December 25th came from, because this Saturnalia was a Roman festival celebrated around the winter equinox, which is in that basic time of year. Has anyone ever heard that before? Or something similar to that? Well, I assure you, if you Google where did Christmas come from, that's one of the first things you're going to see. And this is found in articles written by ignorant people who don't have a clue what they're talking about. This is found by people who talk on the radio. This is found in books. This is found in the sermons of respected preachers. This is found everywhere. A lot of people just have the idea that, Christmas originally, the reason why they picked this day is because they just took a pagan holiday and baptized it. Now it's a Christian holiday. Okay, and we're going to actually talk a little bit more about that, because that has something to do with it as well. That's another idea. There are multiple ideas, but the Saturnalia one is the first one. And of course, you remember I mentioned Constantine. Now, anytime you hear somebody say in reference to Christianity that Constantine did this or that thing, you can almost be assured that they're wrong. Whoever's saying that is wrong. Whenever they say, oh, well, Emperor Constantine, he's the one who really decided that the Trinity was going to be a thing. Not true. Constantine, at the Council of Nicaea, he decided what books were going to be in the Bible. Not true. All right? 99% of the time, if someone's talking about Constantine and what he did to the Christian church, not true. Okay? Now, there are some things. Constantine was a part of history, but he really had no part in forming either the doctrine or the tradition of the church, really in any real way. In fact, we know it couldn't have been Constantine, because the earliest references to December 25th as a day which they celebrate the nativity of Christ, which is the time he was born, his nativity, the earliest dates are around 250 AD. That's about the earliest time in the literature of Christian history that we see a reference to the celebration of Christ's birth, around 250 AD. And of course, that's 70 years before Constantine. So Constantine had absolutely nothing to do with it, rest assured. And what's interesting, though, is that the earliest references to celebrating the nativity of Christ is not December 25th. Does anybody know what that date is? January 6th. In fact, January 6th is the time where the Eastern Orthodox celebrate Christmas. Christmas for the Eastern Orthodox is not December 25th, it is January 6th. Has anyone ever heard of the 12 days of Christmas? What are the 12 days of Christmas? It is the time between December 25th and January 6th. The 12 days of Christmas. Because in the West, Christmas was celebrated 25th of December, and in the East it was January 6th, and there was a lot of fighting that went on about that, but nevertheless, that time in between those two dates became known as the 12 days of Christmas. Now, where did the idea of December 25th come from, though? So we know it had nothing to do with Constantine, and we know, we haven't necessarily demonstrated this yet, but the idea is that it came from Christians wanting to baptize this pagan festival, but actually that's not true. Where did the idea of December 25th came from? Well, it came from this idea, and this is an ancient idea about the perfect life. The perfect life. And what is the perfect life? The ancients had an idea that great men, people like Alexander the Great, people like Julius Caesar, people like Augustus Caesar, these great men of history, including Jesus, that these people died on the same day that they were conceived. This is the idea of the perfect life. And so the reason why December 25th came about is because Jesus died on the Passover, which was a certain day of the month Nisan, according to the Hebrew calendar, which translated over to about the 25th of March. So the idea is that Jesus died on the 25th of March, and because he was a great man, he lived a perfect life, which means he was conceived on the same day he died. Well, what is 9 months after March the 25th? December the 25th. That is where the date came from. December 25th did not come from the idea that Constantine wanted to baptize a pagan tradition. It had nothing to do with that. It had to do with the fact that the ancients believed in this idea of the perfect life. And the idea is that Jesus died on what would have been March the 25th, according to the Julian calendar. And so he was born 9 months after that. He was conceived on the same day he died, born 9 months later, and that day would have been December the 25th. And that's what it boils down to. That's where that date came from. That's how it developed in the literature of Christian history. We don't see in these early references, we see absolutely nothing about Christians talking about, these pagans are having all these festivals, and we really need to take over these festivals so people stop celebrating the pagan gods and they start celebrating the Christian God. That was never even a part of the discussion. Had nothing to do with it at all. What was a part of the discussion was this idea of the perfect life. And in fact, there's actually a very interesting article. And if you want to get this article, get with me and I can give it to you. It's written by a man by the name of Roger Beckwith. All right? R.T. Beckwith is his name. And what he's doing in this article, it's called The Date of Christmas and the Priestly Courses at Qumran. Okay? And what he's doing in this article is he's taking the historical data that is available that is relating to the courses of the priests in the first century. Because you remember in the story in Luke, it talks about Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, how it was his time to do the course of the priest. It was his turn to do the ministry of the priests at the temple. Because what happened is there was a whole different group there was 24 different courses where all these different families would take their turn ministering in the temple. And for Zechariah and his little tribe or his little family, it was their course at a certain time. And what this guy Roger Beckwith is doing is he's taking the historical data about the different courses and the different families of priests and when they were ministering in the temple, and he's trying to put together all of this puzzle to figure out when would Zechariah have been in the temple doing his thing around the time that Jesus would have been born. When would he have been in there? When would he have been visited by the angel? Because it would have been shortly after that John the Baptist would have been conceived. And then it would have been about 6 months later that Jesus would have been conceived. So he's taking this, and the whole article, it's 22 pages, but he's going through all of the courses and the material that's found in Josephus and in the Mishnah and in the Talmud and all of these different sources. And he's trying to put together this puzzle and figure out when was John the Baptist's father there in the temple. And from there, he could figure out when was Jesus born. And once you get down to the end, the conclusion of the article, his conclusion is there is really two more likely dates than any other. And the first one would have been that Jesus would have been born in late December, January, early February. So his first idea is that Jesus would have been born in the middle of winter, sometime more, he says more in January or early February. And then the second most likely time, he says, would have been that he was born sometime in the summer, sometime between late June and early August. So he says there's really two really likely dates. One of the likely dates is in the summer, but the other likely date is in the middle of winter, sometime in January, late December, January, early February, or late June, sometime in July or early August. These are the two. And he figured that out, once again, basing that off of the historical data of the courses of the priests, which he goes through the whole thing. And if you're interested in reading that article, I'd be happy to give it to you. But this is just to me, that's a very interesting thing that talks about, because most people will say, we all know that Jesus wasn't born on December 25th, right? Everyone says, and it's true, we don't know when Jesus was born. I can't tell you what day Jesus was born, but it's assumed just that it's impossible for Jesus to have been born on that day. It's impossible for him to have been born during this time of the year. And what R.T. Beckwith does in his article is he really says, well, no, actually it is possible that he was born in this time of year. Based off the historical data and everything that's there, it is a possibility that he was born in this time of year. But like I say, this date didn't really come into play until about 250 AD, and the primary thing was this idea of the perfect life. Are there any questions or comments about that? No one had ever heard of that idea of the perfect life before?
I find it real interesting.
Yeah, this was an ancient idea, and you can look it up and read more about it. But yeah, the idea was basically, as I say, that great men died the same day that they were conceived. And so that's how the date was actually figured up. It had nothing to do with any of that other stuff. That was the main thing that figured that up. But there's another myth that maybe you've heard. And has anyone ever heard of the movie or seen the movie The Zeitgeist? Has anyone ever heard of that? Ever seen that? Have you heard of that?
The what?
The Zeitgeist?
Sight?
The Zeitgeist. Zeigheist. It is a German word that means spirit, like the spirit of the age. It's called The Zeitgeist. Okay, I guess I'm the only one who's seen this movie. But in this movie, The Zeitgeist, you can look it up. It's on YouTube. It's crazy. You can look it up. And it's called The Zeitgeist. And in this movie, the guy makes a bunch of claims. He claims that Christianity is just one of many solar sun messiahs. Christianity is simply just one of many religions that worships the sun. And he goes through and he lists all these pagan gods, like Horus, the Egyptian god, and some Greek gods, and like Mithra, the Persian god. And he goes through all these different gods, and he says, like Horus, for example, and he says, was born on December 25th of a virgin named Mary, and was followed by a star in the east, and 3 wise men came to visit him, and he walked around and had 12 disciples, and he died by crucifixion, and he was resurrected on the 3rd day. And then it talks about like the god Mithra, and says, born on December 25th of a virgin, followed by 3 wise men, lived, did miracles, died by crucifixion, and was raised on the 3rd day. And he goes through all of these different examples of these supposed religious figures who, when you're listening, you're like, that sounds just like Jesus. And his claim is that these are all examples of sun messiahs, and that Jesus is just another one of these sun messiahs. When Christians worship the risen sun, we're just worshiping the risen S-U-N, the sun that rises in the horizon. This is the idea that is presented. Now, there's a problem with that. And the first problem is that none of that is even true. All those claims that are made about these different gods, how that, take for instance Horus. Horus is the first one he mentioned, so it's the one I focused in on. He says that Horus was born on December 25th of a virgin and was accompanied by a star in the east, that he was worshipped by 3 wise men, had 12 disciples, performed miracles, was crucified, resurrected on the 3rd day, all this stuff. The Egyptian god Horus. Now, none of that is true. That's all fake news. None of that is real. In fact, let me read to you an account of Horus. And there's multiple different accounts, but this is one account of how the Egyptian god Horus came into existence. And there's going to be some kind of graphic, gross stuff here, so forgive me, but this is the story. It says, Horus was born of the goddess Isis. So first of all, we already see there's a problem. This is not even close to what Christianity talks about, because it's polytheistic. This has nothing to do with Christianity, because Christianity is a totally different foundation. Christianity is a monotheistic world dealing with one God who created all things. Off the top, you already see this guy as being born of a goddess. But let me continue. Horus is born of the goddess Isis after she retrieved all of the dismembered body parts of her murdered husband Osiris, except for his penis, which was thrown into the Nile and eaten by a catfish. And then this goddess, Isis, used her magic powers to resurrect Osiris and fashioned to him another penis in order that she may conceive her son, Horus. Does that sound like a virgin birth to you? Does that sound like the nativity of Christ to you?
That sounds like Lala.
That sounds like, yeah. And as you go through and as you hear these claims of all of the dying and rising gods, and as you hear these claims of the solar messiahs, pretty much every single one of them is just like this. They'll say, oh, there's all these there's all these similarities. No, there's not. Go back and read the original sources. Read the source material for these people that they're talking about. It has absolutely nothing to do with Jesus the Messiah. It's not even close. Not even on the same level. But in this movie, and it goes on and it explains here that all of these things, all of these different religious figures, including Jesus, it's describing an astrological event. Because at this time of year, around December the 24th, the Star of Bethlehem, or a star that is called Sirius, is in the sky, and it's the brightest star in the night sky. And around the December 24th, if you look into the horizon, you see that bright star Sirius, and lined up next to it are the 3 stars of Orion's belt. And they're all in a perfect straight line. And then what you notice, it says, is you have these 3 kings following the star that is in the east, and these 3 things are all pointing toward the rising sun. When the sun rises on December 25th, you have lined up perfectly with it is this star Sirius, the Bethlehem star, the star in the east, followed by the 3 kings, or the 3 wise men, which are the 3 stars of Orion's belt, rather. And they are all pointing to the rising sun on December 25th. This is the claim. This is the myth, as I would call it, because and the claim more broadly is that Christianity is simply another religion that worships the risen sun, S-U-N, as opposed to the risen sun, S-O-N. Now, I want to talk about that for a moment because you'll hear this a lot. You'll hear, and it's presented as if Christians are just being duped, like we're worshiping the Son of God, when really what we're worshiping is the Son, S-U-N. The Son, S-U-N, of God. That we worship the resurrected Son, S-O-N, but really we are just worshiping the resurrected S-U-N. That Jesus was never really thought of as the Son of God. He was thought of as the Son of God. And that sound, when you first hear that, and the way it's presented, oftentimes it's so smooth, and it's like, wow, I never thought about that. That makes perfect sense. Everyone's just been making a mistake this whole time. There's a small problem with this, too, though. In English, the word son, S-O-N, and the word son, S-U-N, are what we call homophones, right? They make the same noise. Son and son. They have different meanings, but they sound the same. The problem is that's not true in Greek. It's not true in Latin either. It's not true in many languages. It's true in English. You can see the confusion where, oh, we're worshiping the Son, but really it's the Son. But that's not true in Greek. In fact, the Greek word for son, S-O-N, is huios. And the Greek word for son, S-U-N, is helio. So huios and helio are not the same word. In Latin, the word for son, S-O-N, is filius. And the word for son, S-U-N, is solus. Totally different, right? So that idea, while it may work in English, we worship the Son and not the Son, it doesn't actually work in the ancient languages associated with Christianity. Greek, in which the New Testament was written, and Latin, in which much of the Western Church developed, that concept does not work. So when you hear people talking about the risen Son, understand that argument works in the English language, but what it really is what we call a logical fallacy. And it's the logical fallacy of equivocation, where you take one word and you assign to it a different meaning. And in this case, they're using 2 words that sound the same but mean 2 totally different things. That's called equivocation, and that is a logical fallacy. I know I'm using a bunch of big words about that, but that is the fallacy of equivocation. You take one word that means one thing, and you assign to it a different meaning, and make an argument on that basis. And that's a poor argument. That's an irrational argument. That is a poor way of making a claim. And that's what that does. So that's that. Now, here's another problem with that claim. Because remember, the idea is you have the star Sirius, or the Star of Bethlehem, followed by the 3 stars of Orion's belt, which is the 3 kings, all pointing toward the rising sun on December 25th. So you have the sun is born on December 25th, and the 3 wise men followed the star in the east to get to him, right? That's the claim. There's a problem with that, though, and that's this. The stars are not in the same position on any given day. On December 25th this year, the stars are not going to be in the exact same position December 25th next year. That's just not how it works. And in fact, there are different calendars. How many people know there's different calendars? First of all, there's a solar calendar and a lunar calendar. Now, the solar calendar is based on, originally it was based on the orbit of the sun around the earth, and now we say it's based on the orbit of the earth around the sun. That's neither here nor there. But the solar calendar is based on the sun, while the lunar calendar is based on the phases of the moon, right? But even when we talk about the solar calendar, and we operate off of a solar calendar, okay? Even when we talk about the solar calendar, there's two different solar calendars. Has anyone ever heard this before? Does anyone know the names of the two different solar calendars? We are not on the Julian one, but the Julian one is one of them. So the Julian calendar was created, was instituted, was commissioned by Julius Caesar. It's the Julian calendar. It would have been the Julian calendar that was at use in the Roman Empire throughout much of Christian history, including the time that Jesus was born. But there's another solar calendar, which is called the Gregorian calendar. The Gregorian calendar, which was put together by a bishop in the Roman Church of Gregory. I think it was even Pope Gregory was his name. And this came about in the 1500s, where they realized that the people who made the Julian calendar were actually just a little bit off, and it made a difference over the course of hundreds and thousands of years. It actually made a pretty significant difference. Because the idea is, how many people know there's actually not 365 days in a year? 365 and a quarter. And the Julian calendar says exactly that, 365.25. But according to Gregory and his astronomers, they actually came to a different calculation. Their calculation was 365.2422. Just a little bit different. But as I say, over the course of hundreds of years and thousands of years, it actually, all of that time adds up. And so, as of where we stand today, there is actually a 13-day difference between the Julian calendar and the Gregorian calendar. Today, according to our calendar, which is the Gregorian calendar, it is December the 6th. If we were still following the Julian calendar, today would be November the 25th. So over the course of however long here, there has been about a 13-day. I think every 400 years there's a 3-day difference is how it all kind of plays out. So it has, even the calendars that we use are not the same. Remember, my claim is that the stars are not in the same position from year to year. In fact, our calendars are different. The calendar that they were using when Jesus was born is not even the same calendar we use today. So are the stars going to be aligned like that 13 days after Christmas or on Christmas Day? Or how exactly does all that work? And that doesn't even take into account the lunar calendar, which, if you didn't know, the Jews use a lunar calendar. All of the Jewish festivals, all of the Jewish holidays, all the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar. And as we know from reading through the Gospels in the New Testament, the Gospels in the New Testament is a very Jewish document. Jesus was very much a Jew who, yes, he lived in a Roman society, but all of their religion, all of their tradition, everything they did, it had nothing to do with the solar calendar. It all has to do with the lunar calendar that the Jews follow. Jesus was a Jewish Messiah. It has nothing at all to do with these astrological things. So that's another myth. And here's another problem. Here's the third problem with that idea. The idea that Christianity is just another sun Messiah, and that's why December 25th, and that's where the wise men, that's where that whole story comes from. Well, there's a problem with that. And that's that the earliest generations of Christians didn't even celebrate Christmas. Remember when I said the first mention of the celebration of Christmas was? Does anyone remember?
250.
Around 250 AD. 250 years, roughly, after the birth of Christ. The earliest generations didn't even celebrate Christmas. So why would they create this religion whole cloth out of all this astrological stuff when that wasn't even a part of the tradition in the earliest generations? It didn't even become a part of the tradition until much later. They didn't even celebrate it. None of that had an influence on them. So any thoughts about any of that stuff we've talked about? Any questions or thoughts about that?
When was the first Christmas celebrated?
Sometime around 250 AD, and of course it would have happened in different regions. You know, it's not like one day the call went out and everybody started celebrating Christmas. It'd have been like there were churches in North Africa who were celebrating the nativity of Christ, and there was some churches in Antioch that started celebrating the nativity of Christ, and somehow this bishop, whose writings we have, heard about this, and he wrote about it one time, and we just happened to have those writings around 250 AD because it was a regional thing. And it wasn't until when it was the 4th century that it became like instituted. We're going to talk about this next week when we talk about the history of Christmas, but it was sometime in the 300s that it became like empire-wide, churches-wide. This is when we're celebrating Christmas. And remember, the churches in the East celebrated in January. So there's that whole issue too. Like they celebrated January 6th. The churches in the West celebrated. And you know, there's several. The churches in the East celebrate Easter on a different day as well. Because, I mean, think about it. They didn't exactly have calendars on their walls that you would like flip up and down to know the days of the year in the ancient times. That wasn't a thing. People didn't have smartphones that told them what day it was, you know, in the year 500 AD. That's one of the reasons why the art of astronomy was so important, why you have all these stargazers, and why stargazers in every culture have been such an important people, because that's actually how people kept track of the times and the seasons and the days. That's how they kept track of that stuff, was by observing the stars, which is what God said they were for. Right? Does anyone remember that? When God said, I will give you the stars for the keeping of the days and the times and the seasons. In Genesis, that's what they're for. And cultures throughout all of human history have had a class of people who kept track of all that kind of stuff. Well, when the churches in the East did it a little bit different than the churches in the West did, they came to different dates. And there were literally wars fought about when Easter should be celebrated. Huh? And they keep track of it, and there's a reason why there's been this growth, because there came a point in church history where Christians wanted to really separate from the Jews, and so they completely separated from the Jews, and it actually did a lot of damage, in my opinion, to the Christian church and our understanding, particularly of the Old Testament, when we kind of divorced it from its Jewish roots. That created a lot of problems. That's where you get guys like Origen and the allegorical interpretation and all this kind of crazy stuff that goes on. And it's not really until the Reformation where Christians begin to go back and say, wait a minute, Jesus was a Jew. Maybe we should think about that a little bit more. Maybe we should go back and try to see what they thought about some of this stuff. And that's really a product of the Reformation. And then that's grown into what it is today. But that's neither here nor there. But that's how things were kept track of, is by observing the stars. But there's a second what I call a myth. And I believe this is a myth. And it's that Christmas is pagan. We shouldn't celebrate Christmas because Christmas is pagan. We shouldn't do it. Now, there's a couple problems with that. For example, it says the idea of having a Christmas tree in your house and giving of gifts and making merry, even the date like we talked about, mistletoes and lights on your house. And all of this stuff is pulled from pagan traditions, and it makes the common celebration of Christmas nothing more than a baptized pagan tradition. We're taking and this is talking about the European pagan traditions, and the Catholic Church came in and just took over and baptized these traditions, and now they're Christian now. That's the idea. And, one of the problems with that is what we think of as traditional Christmas celebrations are actually very new. People in the United States of America and in the West more broadly, we're not bringing Christmas trees into their house and lighting them and sitting around the fire giving gifts to their family. None of that started happening until the 1800s. But Christmas has been being celebrated since 250 AD. So what we think of as traditional Christmas celebrations are actually relatively new. And we're going to talk more about this, like I say, next week. But Christmas used to be celebrated in a very different way. But if we're asking the question, did pagans bring evergreen trees into their home to symbolize enduring life in the darkness of winter? Yeah, they did that. Yeah. There were pagan groups in Northern Europe, and yeah, they did that. They would bring in their stuff, those evergreen trees, as a symbol of ongoing life, even in winter. Yeah, they did do that. Did pagans celebrate winter festivals during this time of year? Did they celebrate the winter equinox and have festivities and do all that stuff? Yeah, they did. They did do that. Sure, lots of pagans did that kind of stuff. They were doing it back in Roman days. Saturnalia was a winter equinox festival where the pagans would celebrate and do. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Did pagans make merry and exchange gifts with one another at these festivals? Did they bake things and have feasts and play games and do all that kind of stuff? Yes, they did. Pagans did all of those things. Did pagans bring mistletoe into their fertility goddess worship at this time of the year and do all that kind of stuff? Yeah, they did. That's all very true. But here's my question. So what? What does that have to do with Christmas? Yeah, pagans did all of that stuff. So what? You know what else pagans did? Pagans got married and had children. Does that mean that getting married and having children is pagan and we shouldn't do it? You know what else pagans did? Pagans harvested and gathered food for the winter so they could survive. Does that mean when we do that we're being pagan and we probably shouldn't do that? How many people have wedding rings that they wear? Or have worn maybe at some point? You know where the wedding ring came from? That was a pagan tradition. Maybe we shouldn't do that either because, the pagans are the ones who invented the wedding ring. You know who invented a cell phone? It wasn't an evangelical American Christian, right? So maybe we should stop using cell phones because that technology was created by a pagan. I don't know who invented the wheel, but I'm about 100% sure that person wasn't a Christian. Maybe we should stop using wheels because it's a pagan invention. You see, just because a pagan did something does not mean that when Christians do a similar thing that we are participating in idolatry. That's not what that means. Those are not the same thing. Just because a pagan brought an evergreen tree into its house as some sort of idolatrous worship doesn't mean that if you bring a Christmas tree into your house and light it up with lights and do all the stuff, that you are participating in idolatry like that pagan is. That's not what that means at all. Just because a pagan does something doesn't mean that if you do it, you're participating in idolatry. If that's going to be the standard, then we have to apply that standard to everything. And you know what? Pagans do all the things that Christians do. In various aspects of life. And Scripture actually speaks to this. So now let's go ahead and look at Romans 14. One of the major conflicts in the early church was the issue of eating meat that was sacrificed to idols. Because in these Greek towns there were many temples, and all these temples offered sacrifices to the various gods. And so if you were going to go into a meat market in the city and buy meat to eat, there is like a 90% chance that meat that you were eating was sacrificed to a pagan idol. That's just where all of the meat came from. So if you go in and buy it, that meat that you're eating was sacrificed to an idol. And this was an issue in the early church. And there were some people who said we shouldn't eat meat at all because of this. And then there's the Apostle Paul who says it really doesn't matter because an idol doesn't mean anything. But let's go ahead and read. We're going to read through in the time that we have and talk about some of the stuff that this says. So let's read Romans 14. Let's do verses 1 through 3.
Except the one whose faith is weak, without quarreling over disputable matters. One person's faith allows him to eat anything, but another whose faith is weak eats only vegetables. The one who eats everything must not treat with contempt the one who does not, and the one who does not eat everything must not judge the one who does, for God has accepted him.
Okay, so this is very important. What's he talking about? They don't eat anything, they only eat vegetables. What's the deal? That's the deal. The deal is the whole issue of meat sacrificed to idols. And what is the Apostle Paul saying? He says there's two groups of people. What are they? One who does eat the meat, which we know was sacrificed to idols, and a group who doesn't because it violates their conscience. Well, when I think of holidays, and particularly a holiday like Christmas, I place it into this category. There are two groups of people. There are people who celebrate Christmas, and there are people whose conscience will not allow them to celebrate Christmas because they believe that it is tied to paganism and idolatry. And I take the holiday issue and I put it right here into this category. Okay? And what does he say in verse 3? This is the most important part of the conversation. What does he say in verse 3?
God accepts them.
God accepts them, and who is them in this case?
Both parties.
Both parties. Both parties. He says, let not the one that does eat despise the one that does not. Do not, if you celebrate Christmas, don't look down and despise the people who don't, because their conscience doesn't allow them to do it. Don't despise that person. And at the same time, let the one that does not eat, do not judge the one who does eat. For those who do not celebrate Christmas because of their own convictions, you're not allowed to judge the people who do. One person's conscience allows them to do it, another's doesn't allow them to do it. But what else does it say in verse 3? God has received them both. And so it goes on in verse 4. Look at verse 4. What's that say?
Who are you to judge the servant of another? To his own master he stands or falls. And stand he will, for the Lord is able to make him stand.
So he says, you eat the meat, you celebrate Christmas, don't judge the one who doesn't. You don't eat the meat, you don't celebrate Christmas, don't judge the one who doesn't. Why?
You're not the judge.
You're not the judge. That's right.
God's the judge.
You're not the judge.
God knows what's in your heart.
Exactly. God knows if we don't, you don't give account to me, I don't give account to you, we both give account to God. That's what really matters. In fact, he goes on and let's look at verse 5 and 6. 5 and 6.
One person esteems one day above another, another esteems every day alike. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it to the Lord, and he who does not observe the day to the Lord, he does not observe it. He who eats, eats to the Lord, for he gives God thanks. And he who does not eat to the Lord, he does not eat, he gives God thanks.
Okay, so here again, now this time he's actually talking about days, particular days, and this comes into like a Jewish-Gentile conflict because, of course, the Jews had many holy festivals, and there was the Saturday Sabbath and all that different stuff that's going on. And what's Paul saying? He says, some people regard this day as holy, and other people don't. Again, some people celebrate these holidays, other people don't. And what does Paul say to do?
Live and let live.
Yeah, in a sense. And at the end of verse 5, he says, let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. So do what your conscience will allow you to do, but know what you're doing and know why you're doing it. Be fully persuaded. If you're going to honor one day as holy, at least know why you're honoring it as holy. If you're going to honor every day the same, at least know why you're doing that. Be fully persuaded in your own mind. And what does he say about the one who does or does not regard a day? Who are they regarding it to? The Lord. As a believer, if you celebrate Christmas, your celebration, you're honoring that day as holy unto the Lord. We ought to be, if we're celebrating, and that's how we should celebrate it. And the one who doesn't celebrate it is not celebrating that in honor to the Lord. And he goes on, says the same thing. The one who eats gives thanks to God for what he can eat. And the one who does not eat also gives thanks to God. The one who celebrates the holiday does so in thanksgiving to God. The one who does not celebrate does so in thanksgiving to God. So what is important here? Is it the celebrating or the not celebrating?
No, it's what you're doing for God.
It's what you're doing for God. It is the attitude of your heart toward God while you are doing what you are doing.
That's another place that says, do everything you do for the Lord.
That's right. Whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, Do it for the Lord. And that includes the days that we do or do not celebrate. Just in the final moments here, let's look at verse 7 through 9.
For none of us lives to himself, and no one dies to himself. For if we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. Therefore, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's. For to this end Christ died and rose and lived again, that he might be Lord of both the dead and the living.
Okay, and so what is he saying here? Nobody lives to themselves, and nobody dies to themselves. If we live, we're living unto the Lord. If we die unto the Lord. If we eat unto the Lord. If we abstain unto the Lord. If we celebrate unto the Lord. If we abstain from celebration, we do so unto the Lord. Nothing that we do is just about us. But in everything we do, whether we eat or we drink, we do all unto the glory of God. And he finishes it up by saying, this is the reason why he died and rose again, that he may be Lord of the dead and the living. Now there's more to this chapter that I think is important that we get to. And I think that next week, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the history of Christmas and how it developed. But I want to come back to chapter 14 because this is only the first aspect of it. And the first aspect of it is, hey, don't judge somebody based on whether or not they celebrate the holiday. You know, if you're a Christian and you celebrate Christmas, don't look down on Christians who don't celebrate Christmas. And if you're a Christian who doesn't celebrate Christmas because your conscience just won't allow it, you're not allowed to judge those who do. Because we will all stand before God. We serve one master. I'm not your judge, you're not mine, but we are all judged of the Lord. And as people who are celebrating or not, our celebration, first of all, should be unto the Lord. There is a right and a wrong way to celebrate holidays. And that's true. And if our celebration of Christmas is just the worldly 21st century American consumeristic celebration of Christmas, we're doing it wrong, and we are participating in nothing more than a pagan festival. It is nothing more than that, if that's what our Christmas is. If we're going to celebrate a holiday, we should celebrate that day as holy unto God. But nevertheless, there is more to the story than just live and let live. That's not where the chapter ends, because there's more to be said about it than simply that. So my goal is to come back to this next week. Maybe we can finish up chapter 14 after we talk about a brief history of Christmas. But is there any thoughts? Did anybody learn anything today? Any comments, questions, anything of that nature before we come to a close?
I have some friends that don't celebrate Christmas. And when they decided to do that, they alienated a lot of people in their family. And I personally, I look at them and I'm going, you're missing out on a lot. But what the word is saying, they're doing it unto the Lord. And that's what I got out of it. I have to look at them not as some strange customs, because they're part of the Messianic Jew church. And I don't know if that has something to do with it or not, but just because they don't celebrate Christmas, I have to look at it that they're doing that as unto the Lord. And they're not judging me for celebrating Christmas. So I just kind of thought, oh, you're just missing out on so much. That's just so legalistic of you to do this way. But then I have to say, they're doing it unto the Lord.
Yeah.
I also have a Messianic friend. And that's not the biggest reason why she pulled out of Christmas. She was very, very poor. She was trying very hard. She was from a very large family. She was racking up credit card bills, trying to buy everybody Christmas presents, and she was stressing out. And she'd just about get the credit card bills paid off when she'd be shopping again for Christmas. And as she got to studying the Messianic stuff, she's like, you know what, guys? I'm going to pull back and I'm going to celebrate Hanukkah. And I'm going to focus on the miracles of Hanukkah because so many people in her family were not saved. It wasn't about Christ. And she's like, I'm not gonna tell you guys not to have Christmas, but she's like, please don't buy me any Christmas presents. I'm not buying you any Christmas presents, and I may or may not drop by and say hi that day. And it took a lot of the pressure off of her. And so when the Messianic people forego Christmas, most of them that I have met are not being judgmental of people who do. They're just like, there's more important things we want to focus on.
And you know, that's really understandable, especially in the modern climate of what Christmas is today in our culture. Because Christmas is a lot of things in our culture, but it's definitely not Christ-centered per se. So it's understandable that someone would make that decision, you know. And just like oftentimes people do for that, and I also know people who don't celebrate Christmas and celebrate Hanukkah, and the same deal. Oftentimes they have a gentle and humble spirit about it, and everyone should, you know, if we can give each other that kind of mutual respect and grace, then it's all good. And I think that is what Paul is talking about here. Cool. Anything else? Well, don't go home and look through your family tree and try to figure out when everyone was conceived and start doing the math. Maybe you have a great person in your family tree who died the same day they were conceived. But I thought that a lot of this was interesting anyway. I hope it was a blessing to you as well. These are claims that, you know, if you pick up a New York Times article about Christmas this time of year, if you do a Google search about where Christmas came from, you're going to hear this kind of stuff. You know, your edgy atheist friend at Christmas dinner is going to be talking about all this stuff, and this is just the way that it is. But I hope that through this, maybe you learned something. Maybe you're a little more better equipped to have those kind of conversations now. And I hope at least you found it interesting. And like I say, we'll come back next week. I would like to talk about the development of Christmas, kind of a brief history of Christmas. How did it turn into what it is today? Because I can assure you, you know, back in 325 AD, there was a Saint Nick, but he wasn't decking the halls, he was decking the heretics, okay? So it was a totally different thing. And we're going to talk about some of that next week as we come to a close. Brother Charlie, will you close us in prayer?